So should we just begin? Um, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So Avirup, you want to just make an introduction, or then we can start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we are very happy to have Nathan Nunn from Harvard University giving us a talk on climate change and conflict in Africa. So Nathan, anytime you can start.
Okay. Terrific. So, I should get to the title page here. So this is a paper I'm presenting. It's with my co-author Owen McGurk, who's at Tufts University, and as was indicated, it's about climate change within Africa. And in particular, it's thinking about climate change and conflict. And so how does climate change contribute to conflict within Africa? So if we're thinking about the African continent, there's some reasons to think that climate change might be particularly detrimental or damaging to the African continent in particular. Things like low living standards come to mind, weak national institutions, heavy reliance on agriculture. So these are all things that are particular to the African continent. But actually what we're going to focus on in this talk is something different, a different characteristic. And that's the fact that a big proportion of Africa's population, so estimated to be 22%, obtain most of their income from animals, so they're pastoral. In terms of land mass, it's an even larger proportion of Africa. It's 43% of Africa's land mass supports pastoral activities. So most pastoral groups are transhumant, meaning that they're seasonally nomadic. And so this is going to result, or this does result in particular relationships with farmers, which are sensitive to changes in weather and in climate. So let me just describe those now, what these relationships are. So within the African continent, there's two main seasons, the wet season and then the dry season. And so in many other parts of the world, including South Asia, there are these two dominant seasons. There's a wet growing season and then a dry season. And so I'm just showing this here. This map shows precipitation. It's millimeters per month, and what it's showing typical precipitation or average precipitation from 1951 to 2019. So you can see in a wet season month, August, from the perspective of the Northern Hemisphere here. And then January is a dry season month in the Northern Hemisphere, but it's a wet season month in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay, so you have these patterns here. So what happens here, you can see with this red polygon, this is a stylized example, but think of this as the traditional territory of pastoral groups. So pastoral groups in this part of Africa tend to live further north on more marginal lands, which is in the Sahel region. So this is showing you the wet season here. So when water is plentiful, plant matter is plentiful. And this area here, even though it's more marginal, it can sustain wild grasses. So animals can graze on these wild grasses in this territory here. And further south, what you have is farmland. And then farmers are planting, and then at the end of the wet season, harvesting crops. Okay, so then after harvest and during the dry season, this land here, you can see there's not rainfall. Not hardly any rainfall, and there's hardly any plant matter. And so they migrate, these individuals with their herds would migrate south, and then those animals would be able to eat plant matter, which is in this land here. And this is land which in the wet season is farmland, but now it's fallow. And so the farmers aren't using it and the pastoralists do use it. It's a bit of a win-win situation because the animals will graze on the land, which is left fallow, and then they'll provide organic or deposit organic fertilizer, right? And so even though Africa doesn't use a lot of chemical fertilizer, yeah, it does have organic fertilizer through these natural exchanges. And then when the rains come, and then the land in the blue polygon is used for farming, then the pastoral groups will typically return to their homelands, and this will be land where their villages are, and women and children are located. And they'll return to the homeland, and then the animals will graze in this more marginal land, but because it's the wet season, the more marginal land does have a fair amount of phytomass. So these routes that are taken are called transhumance routes, and this seasonal migration is called transhumance. Here's some examples from the an FAO publication, just showing you some examples of the routes. And the direction is indicated by the arrow. A hollow arrow means a wet season direction, so what the direction they had during the wet season, and then a dark arrow, the direction during the dry season. You can see it's often north-south, but not always. It's east-west or different directions. If you went to a different part of Africa, like around Ethiopia, it could be in different directions as well. And then you see that they often cross borders as well, right? And so the examples that I showed, the stylized examples, pastoral groups would have been crossing borders.
Nathan, just a clarificatory question.
Yep.
So, are these typically the same farmers who are, I mean, are they kind of partitioned into being pastoral and sedentary, or is it that they have dual kind of, that they grow, but also some of them, year to year, they're different people moving up north or east or wherever they move?
Yeah. You would think of it as the stylized case. There's going to be a lot of variation. Is going to be one ethnic group is pastoral, so they engage primarily in pastoral activities, and then there's another ethnic group that are the sedentary farmers. And so, of course, they might have some goats or chickens or animals, but in general, in terms of one group is migrating, but then the other group is sedentary. So that's the stylized way of thinking of it. Yeah. So two different groups. Yeah. So, okay. So, and what's been happening over the continent during this time? This is the Sahel. So this region here that I was showing you. This is deviations in precipitation from long run averages in each year from 1901 to 2017. Okay, and so this is what this shows here. And this is just showing what's well known. Since the late 60s, there's been persistent negative or adverse rainfall shocks, so less rainfall than average, right? So with global warming, as we all know, temperatures are rising, but what does this mean on the African continent? It means less rainfall, actually. It's because of warming over the Atlantic that affects the weather patterns that cause drier, the land over the Sahel and over much of Africa to be drier, okay? And so that's what we think about when we're thinking about global warming, climate change within this context. And so what happens in this case, so think of a wet season, which is shown in this picture here. During the wet season, what's supposed to be happening is the pastoral group is supposed to be on the more marginal land, but because it's the wet season, it can support animals. But imagine now there's an adverse rainfall shock, so there's drought, there's less water than normal. And so what might happen then is there's not enough plant matter here to support the herds. So then they have to start to migrate. They might migrate early, and they might migrate to the farmland before harvest. Okay, so this is an atypical or irregular movement of pastoralists onto the nearby farmland. And now there's a conflict of interest. So in the previous example, there was this kind of symbiotic relationship, win-win. But now, because they've had to migrate early, the farmers are still using the land for farming, and the pastoralists are trying to use the land for herding. And so these are photos of actual examples of this. This is from Ghana. This is from a master's dissertation from an individual who was from the region, so a town called Agogo. And so the top image shows, well, the maize are destroyed from these cattle, these stray cattle, and then the farmers retaliate by killing the cattle. Okay, and so this is an example of how adverse rainfall shocks is inducing this migration, and in a location that's different from where the shocks are felt, there's an equilibrium conflict emerging. Okay, and so this is kind of the story, and you hear a lot about this. So here's just an example from Foreign Affairs from 2019. The title is "The Deadliest Conflict You've Never Heard of." And down here, it talks about the conflict is mainly between sedentary crop farmers and nomadic cow herders, where competition over diminished land and water resources has turned lethal in recent years, basically. Okay, and so this is very, very common. There's another example here. This is from Time magazine just in the last few years. and also talking about climate change and how this is putting pressure on resources and causing these conflicts to be more frequent. And one interesting aspect of this, which we'll talk about, is religion, because the pastoralists tend to be Muslim, and then the sedentary groups tend to be Christian. And so these conflicts are often painted as religious conflicts or jihadist conflicts. Was there a question?
Yeah, Nathan, my question was, what do we know about the long-term kind of relations between these groups? These could be just focal points of, these things just, adding up in some sense, expressions of innate kind of dislike for each other. So do we know that, or is it just these flashpoints that are being driven only by these incidents?
Yeah, so there could be other reasons or reasons that groups fight. And so we'll look at the analysis and we'll want to control for that. So for example, at the boundaries of groups, you might have conflict just naturally, and I'm sure some of that's occurring. And so we'll see that there's this story that I just told, which is what we want to test empirically, and then see, okay, what can we do about this? This actually might be the next slide, yeah, is, that there's a story, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but can we actually put the data together, run regressions, and then put a number on it? And so the issues that you're highlighting are definitely important. And when we get to the equation, we'll want to be cognizant of, okay, can we, control for those things? And then, but one thing that's nice is about the story was very specific. And I'll go through and talk about, it's rainfall here causing groups to move, but not all groups, just this very specific type of group that has animals and that it is mobile. And then that's causing conflict in a different location. And the story was even about when the conflict should occur during the wet season. We can test that. And so, so we'll look at all of that. And so we'll see. And then the nice thing we can do after that is say, okay, well, what policies can help alleviate this? If this is a concern and we want to reduce this or help reduce the impacts of climate change on that specific type of conflict, what can be done, right? And there's natural things that come to mind, which are here, and then political solutions we'll also look at, right? But so we'll get to that.
But Nathan, is there typically a spatial correlation between the rainfalls in those two seasons, in those two areas? So like at the time when in the pastoral area, there is you have the stuff. So similarly in the farmland areas too, rains are less, and there's already a pressure on the farming sector. And then in addition, these people come back, and that makes it worse. Or are they kind of slightly different systems of weather?
Well, so they're probably going to be correlated, or they are correlated for sure. I'll show you some maps about the distribution of rainfall, and you'll see that actually rainfall is a bit different than temperature. Temperature is just kind of like warm everywhere, as you know, at one period of time. Rainfall, there's warmer temperature, but then some places get more rain. Other places will be in the shadow of a mountain range or something and get less rain. So there's more variability in rainfall. But we'll see that we'll be able to identify the shock in the herder's land while conditioning on rainfall in the farmer's land, for example. And we haven't looked at the interaction of the two, which is kind of what you're suggesting, which would be interesting. And once we get there, we can talk more about do we expect the farmer's rainfall shock to be good or bad for conflict, or increase or decrease conflict? Yeah. Okay, great. Any other questions, comments? Okay, terrific. So we're going to look at conflict as an outcome. We're going to look at fine-grained, or we do look at very fine-grained data. And so this is looking at Africa specifically. It's geo-referenced, so we know the exact location of conflict events. There's two sources, UCDP and ACLED. I won't go into too much detail except to say that UCDP is great because it goes back to 89. ACLED only goes back to 97. But there's this pretty high death threshold, 25 death threshold to be included in the database, 25 deaths within a year. So that example of the farmer killing the cows of a herder, where the cows got into into his cornfields, and then maybe the herders retaliating. Even if 1 or 2 people died, that wouldn't be in this data set, right? And yeah, so ACLID does a lot better. It doesn't have that minimum death threshold, and so it contains a lot more conflict events, including these smaller scale ones, which we think are going to be important. So I'll show you those though. So that's pretty standard. The one thing that's new in terms of data collection, which we need to create ourselves, is a measure of transhumant pastoralism. Okay, so if you think of transhumant pastoralism, it's 2 things. One is pastoralism, that you have animals that you herd, and the other is that you move with them, right? And so it's the herding part, basically. And so we can measure transhumants from the Ethnographic Atlas, which is this database of about 400 ethnic groups within the African continent, and we know what's their traditional practices. What are their, what were their traditional practices before colonialism? And one of the variables is this measure here, which is measure of mobility, basically, or measure of the nature of settlements, including no mobility. And there's 8 categories here, okay, for these. And with these 8 categories, basically, you can see that there's 2 here, which are mobile. And if we go further down, there's 2 more, which are kind of semi-mobile. Okay, let me just see here. Okay, terrific. And so there's a natural border here where you can say, okay, above this point, or these here, we're going to call them mobile, or these here, we're not going to call them mobile. Okay, and so we're going to use this natural cutoff here, and we're going to create 2 cutoffs, which are, oops, something's going on, which is this cutoff here and then this cutoff here. Okay. Okay. So then the second is, I'm not sure how to get rid of that line, but
I think
where that came from.
Someone has somehow managed to annotate. Can I just ask a question? I have
Sure.
a couple of things. What is the, the diet is defined exactly how? What is the unit there? I couldn't quite get that. Is it?
Oh, here the unit is just an ethnic group.
Okay.
So yeah, so I haven't shown you the data setup or the regression equations. So, but we want to know, the different groups around Africa, how many of them are engaged in transhumant pastoralism, right? That's going to be one thing that's going to be important to identify this. And so for about 400 ethnic groups, we have this information, and we basically, from these categories, create a measure, which is an indicator variable for transhumance, which is mobility. Yeah, and then I'll explain how we use that. Yeah, exactly. Was there another question as well?
Yeah, I had one more. So, in these are all human to human conflicts, or do you also include the fact that, there's a potential animal, like it may not be recorded, but like if you go around killing cattle, then there's also conflict, but it may not show up, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. We should look into the data to see if that's included, because there are conflict events. So it's not every event is like a deadly conflict, but typically what they'll focus on are things like troop movements. Like if you move your troops from one location to another, if you destroy a bridge, for example, that would be kind of parts of civil conflict that could be recorded in the database. But I don't know how common it is. Yeah, that cattle were killed. Actually, that's a good question. I'll look into that. Yeah, and so, but I would think the majority of cases here are cases where the cattle are killed, but then there's retaliation, then it escalates so that it's
Right.
two-sided, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Then the second part is pastoralism. And so this is from the same database, we know basically the share of subsistence each group gets from animals. And then we also know what their primary animal is. So we interact the share of subsistence from animals with an indicator if the primary animal is a herded animal. So pig, for example, is a large animal, but you don't herd pigs, right? And so chickens would be another example. So this is basically just the share of subsistence that you get from herded animals. So then we have the two parts. One is the transhumance, and then the other is the pastoralism. If we just interact those two measures, then we get a measure of transhumant pastoralism. Okay, and this is at the ethnic group level for about 400 ethnic groups across the continent. And this is just showing you the distribution. So in the database, or Murdoch has kind of roughly mapped the traditional territories of these different groups. Okay, and so this one here, for example, is the Maasai, which is kind of well-known group from Kenya and Tanzania. And there's some other groups here, the Samburu and the Turkana. And then this is kind of, consistent with the stylized example I gave you, where the pastoral groups are on the more marginal lands, which are in the Sahel, the Saharan desert. Okay.
So there's a question in the chat. I'll just take it up quickly.
Sure.
About crossing borders. So if you have groups that go across country borders, how do different policies how would they affect migration across these territories?
Yeah, so that's one thing we haven't looked at yet. We'll see that the analysis actually is going to be just kind of ignore borders to some extent. It'll take them into account, but we're going to allow spillovers over borders. And so, and then we'll see that national policies do matter, but we haven't looked explicitly at this cross-border effects, which we could actually. It's kind of a really interesting part of this, and so I'll show you at first that the ways in which countries' policies matter, and then we could kind of come back maybe at the end and then think about, okay, what does this mean for spillovers across borders or groups that are in one country and go across another border? Yeah. Okay, so that's the narrow measure, and this is the broad measure. They're almost essentially identical. That's just using those two different cutoffs for transhumance or mobility. And so what are we going to do with the data? This is basically the data. These are the different ethnic groups. The shading indicates, are they transhumant pastoralism? Are they transhumant pastoral? The dots are the locations of conflict events. So we're going to use geography or physical location. And we divide the continent into half-degree by half-degree grid cells, which are shown here. And we're going to look and see, okay, is there a conflict event within a particular grid cell? Okay. And for each grid cell, what we're going to do is we're going to define its nearest neighbor. So remember, a big part of the story is there's shocks in my neighbor's territory. They're a different ethnic group and they're pastoral. There's a shock over there, and then they come and there's conflict in my area, in my grid cell. So we want to know what's the nearest neighboring ethnic group to this grid cell. And in this case, it would be Zenega, for example. If you had a grid cell that was down here, it might be the Mossi, right? And so technically it's the centroid of the grid cell, and then we find the point on a neighboring polygon that's closest, right? So each grid cell gets a nearest neighbor, okay? And in this regression here, what we're going to do, this is just descriptive. I think it's a nice way to start. We're going to have conflict as the outcome. And then we're going to look across grid cells. And each grid cell is going to have an ethnicity associated with it. So that's what ethnic group the grid cell lies within. So in this case, it's Messina. And then we're just going to have repeated cross sections here. And so we'll do more, but this is just to analyze the data and just get comfortable with the setup. So we'll have year fixed effects. And this measure here, it varies at the cell level, right? But it's a measure of how transhumant pastoral the cell's nearest neighbor is. So in this example up here, this cell, its nearest neighbor would be Zenega. And so that measure would be Zenega's measure of transhumant pastoralism. This cell here might be Songhai. And so it would be that measure, right? And so this cell here might be Dogon, and so it would be that measure. Okay, so that's what that is. And then this measure here is the measure of the ethnic group itself, how transhumant pastoral is it? Okay, and so, oops, I went too fast. And so this would be, okay, this cell here, what's the ethnic group, and is it transhumant pastoral? Okay, and so this is just descriptively. And like I said, a big part of the story is spillovers, right? And so it's actually your neighbor that might matter more than yourself, okay? And we might expect that transhumant pastoralism is associated with more conflict in the cross section. Okay, so none of this has to do with climate change yet. We're just, just descriptive analysis. And what you find here, so these are the different conflict outcomes, UCDP and ACLID, that there's a positive relationship between my nearest neighbor being transhumant pastoralism and being transhumant pastoral, and how much conflict there is in my grid cell. And it matters more than actually whether my own ethnic group is transhumant pastoral. Okay, so if my neighbor is transhumant pastoral, there's more fighting. That's more important than whether I'm transhumant pastoral. So this is just some indication that these spillovers matter. And this is the narrow measure. This is the broad measure. Okay, and you can see the mean of the dependent variables here. That's just incidence of conflict in a grid cell in a year. Okay, and then the coefficients you can see are quite large, particularly relative to the mean, right? And so, okay, so but yep.
So two questions. One, given that the definition of transhumant pastoralism is coming from Ethnographic Atlas, how mobile have these groups been over a period of time? So like in the current zone versus say 1800 or 1900, do the groups still stay within the same 5 by 5 or 0.5 by 5 grid? And you also, yeah, that's first question, then I'll ask the other one.
Okay. They wouldn't necessarily stay within the 5.5 grid, but you can see they would stay in this general territory. So they haven't tended not to migrate and displace other groups, right? And so, yeah, and so, so there's some stability. Lots of them have abandoned traditional practices. So you think of this as kind of an intent to treat or something that's predetermined, but yeah.
I see. And the other question is, within the table, do you then run a regression where you include an interaction term for your neighbor being transhuman and you not being transhuman, and hence that potentially drives the conflict?
Yeah, so you could interact these two variables really. And then what we find is in older versions, we had that the interaction doesn't matter so much, right? So, if your neighbor's transhumant pastoral, there's fighting in your cell, regardless of whether you're transhumant pastoral or not, right? There's no additional effect from you both being transhumant pastoral. Yeah, so it's really, and so this is the dominant effect. And then we just weren't sure if the interaction was ad hoc, but that's a natural thing to do, is to see. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Nathan, just as a side, not to do with this. I mean, you said that these people have. I think Palash asked this question also. I mean, is there a regression where one can show that the movement of these particular communities over time has, in fact, depends on their initial kind of contiguity in terms of this conflict? I mean, because though you don't use it, but potentially even the movements over time will be a reaction to these kind of conflicts. And that could be one equilibrium solution in the long run towards these kind of climate change things, that communities kind of relocate and...
No, I think that's right. I think what's less likely, so they could relocate for sure. But I think what's even more common would be they stop engaging in that activity that's causing problems. So they stop being transhumant pastoral. Okay. So, and that's what governments are trying to promote in many countries, is saying, okay, you can be pastoral, but you should have ranches with boundaries like ranches like in North America. And so you shouldn't be nomadic, basically. And a lot of groups have become sedentary. Governments prefer groups to be sedentary because they can keep track of them and educate children and that sort of thing. So I think that's one thing that's happened. Yeah.
So on that line, is there, for example, country-wise variation in private property rights where this kind of ranching has happened already versus those where it's still different? I mean, you could even say colonial past and so forth would confer property rights like that. So do you think that, is it just very normal to do it like a common property and just move around?
Well, yeah, in this setting, it's pretty standard, I would say, historically, to have more common property ownership is more flexible, like, or, you know, you could own the land, I could own the land. We could both use it in some sense, like our lineages both use this land. And so, yeah, so a very different view, a different version of property rights in Western. So we'll come to some political economy stuff at the end, where I think a very reduced form way of looking at it is say, who's in government? Like there's tons of policies they could implement, including property rights and maybe policies to promote settlement. Who's in government? Is it pastoral groups or non-pastoral groups? And then is this causing these effects to be bigger or smaller? And so that's kind of what we've done so far. I'll show you that. Yeah. So,
okay, thanks.
Great. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so now we're ready. I think all we're going to do is introduce rainfall shocks. Okay, and so this is from, I won't go through the, because of time, the data, but it's reanalysis. So we have it at the grid cell level. There's 85,000 globally underlying weather stations. So we think it's a high quality, as far as we know, the highest quality data set at this resolution that we can use that provides precipitation. We have even better data actually on phytomass, on organic living plant matter. And this is measured at 1 kilometer level. It's only since 1999, but you could use this again or you could use this as well. Remember, the story was there's not enough grass in the pastoral group's land, and so they have to come down early. And so actually grass is the proximate channel. And so we'll integrate that as well. So why rainfall? So one could look at temperature. If you just look at the data, what you find is rainfall explains a lot more of the variation in plant growth than temperature, even with just very simple regressions that are that aren't very flexible, that are kind of coarse, but you see that's clear. And so, and I'm not sure what, you know, the situation or how this compares to South Asia, but in Africa, really, the constraining factor for plant growth is precipitation, or is water, right? If things raise the temperature by 1 degree or 2 degrees up or down, that doesn't matter so much. It might be 28 versus 29 degrees. But if there's half as much rainfall as normal, that causes big problems. And so, yeah, so it's a little bit hard for people to think of from Western Europe, because early frost is so important. You think, oh, temperature is really important. But in a tropical climate, temperature is much less important. And then this is the one thing I was mentioning before, where this is just the deviations from long run trends across the continent in temperature. It's pretty spatially correlated. But then rainfall, these rainfall shocks and what climate change is doing, you can see there's actually a fair amount of variation, right? And so, so there's, yeah, not as much spatial correlation with rainfall as there is with temperature. And so that's kind of nice for the types of analysis we're going to do. So these are the regressions. And it's actually kind of a variant of the regressions I just showed you. We have this variable, which
Nathan, just a clarification. Sorry. So given this idiosyncratic kind of non-correlated spatial nature, right now you're looking in some sense at contiguity as being a kind of an important way of movement, right? But you can think about like a domino effect, where because of various things, there are some people moving to other people's territories and so on and so forth, and then you get a domino effect way down the line in some other area. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, so what we're doing, this is a very coarse measure. It's just kind of like 0-1, are you a neighbor or not? But there could be groups that migrate to your area, which are 2 ethnic groups away, or or like you said, there could be spillovers and then spillovers, and exactly. And so so that's exactly right. So I think we're kind of have a very coarse measure of treatment, and if we had a better measure, we would have more precise estimates. Yeah, I think I'd agree completely with that. Yeah. So, was there another question? Okay. Okay, great. So what we have here is this measure of nearest neighbor. And so think of, we're going to have, again, grid cells and conflict in that grid cell. And now we're going to measure rainfall in your nearest neighbor, right? And so this is rainfall in the nearest neighbor of the ethnic group. And then we're going to interact this with this variable, which you already saw, which is the nearest neighbor transhumant pastoral? Because the story is, if they're transhumant pastoral and they experience an adverse rainfall shock, they will migrate to my cell, and there might be conflict in my cell. And just to be completely symmetric, what we're going to do is control for rainfall in my own ethnic group, and then interacted with is my own ethnic group transhumant pastoral. And then even rainfall in my own cell, and then that interacted with is my own ethnic group transhumant pastoral. Okay. And in the analysis, we're also going to have cell fixed effects, right? And then country year fixed effects. Okay. And then we'll have two-way clustering of the standard errors to account for spatial correlation. So, some of the things we were talking about, well, certain locations, there might be fighting between two groups because it's a boundary or they don't like each other. And so the cell fixed effect should pick that up. And then the other thing is, actually, I think it might even have a slide on this. So this would be these cell fixed effects. And then there's a lot of determinants in the literature. So Fearon and Layton, Collier and Hoffler, a lot of in the cross-country regression literature, a lot of determinants, and those will be captured by these country year fixed effects. Okay. And then there's also been a literature about how rainfall affects conflict, right? But that's not the spatial spillover. This is rainfall in a cell affects conflict in the cell. And even there might be spillovers in the contiguous cells, and that'll be captured here too, right? Because we're measuring rainfall in my own ethnic group, right? And so what's key here is the part of the story is an interaction with whether the ethnic group is transhuman pastoral, that and the fact that there's a spatial spillover. It's rainfall in my neighbor's ethnic group, and then that interacted with, are they transhuman pastoral? Okay.
Nathan, I'm just wondering why we don't have a standardized kind of deviation measure of rainfall in the spirit of shock. Of course, you have a fixed effect here cell, which is demeaning the rainfall over the periods, but there is a variability which, places which cells which generally have, you keep having shocks. You would expect behaviors to be very different, right?
Yeah. So, so it is standardized, as you say, because you have the cell fixed effects. But we could have standardized the measure, and we would have just had to make some assumptions, like every cell, like create indicators for the 10th percentile or the 90th percentile, and then estimate it flexibly. Yeah, and so there's no reason that we didn't do that, except that just choosing one as a baseline and then assuming linear was kind of what we did.
I'm just thinking about this variability idea that there are patterns in these things, right? So they're pastorals who are used to having bad rainfall every third year. So kind of so you wouldn't expect real conflict in some sense, or I don't know what you would expect, but you'd expect people to take into account that behavior and move accordingly. So I'm just wondering that you don't have here because of the lack of the variance in some sense, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And part of it is that we have such a short panel that we kind of look at the mean, but then which is the first moment, the second moment, and kind of would also be interesting to look at, but it would be pushing the data a bit further. Yeah. Okay. So So
the question here, what's the difference between columns 1 and 2 and 3, state and non-state?
So this is kind of the same structure as the previous table. This is UCDP and then ACLID, and then so any conflict, and then conflicts that involve the state. So that means one of the two actors is a state actor. So it could be the military, but even the police. So if there's a conflict and the police get involved and then the herders start fighting the police, that would be called a civil conflict or a state involved conflict. And then non-state is both sides are neither side is the government, right? And so and so what you see here, this is, remember, UCDP has that really high threshold, and it's very infrequent that you have non-state conflicts that are above 25 deaths in a year. And then once you look at the ACLID, you see it, but for UCDP, it's a lot weaker, right? But what you find is this negative relationship. And so what does this mean? It's a bit confusing. More rainfall means less conflict. In other words, less rainfall means more conflict. Okay, so all these coefficients would mean negative, but it means lack of rainfall causes conflict. And these are all those variables that I had in the regression. You can see that one interaction matters, and that's it. And that's the interaction between rainfall in my nearest neighbor and my nearest neighbor being transhumant pastoral. So if they're not transhumant pastoral, it doesn't matter whether or not it rains in my neighbor's territory, right? And so this is kind of one of the clear predictions of this very specific story. And then here's just the calculated effect. So we calculate one standard deviation change within a cell, and then average, and look at an average. And so how much does that does the coefficient predict that one standard deviation change will affect conflict relative to the mean? You can see it's a 40% relative to the mean. Okay, so these are pretty big effects. And you just see that by comparing the coefficient up here to the mean of the dependent variable, which is down here. Okay.
Nathan?
Yep.
Sorry, so I'm just wondering how much of this is actually a persistent story, because your weather events might be serially correlated, and hence if you throw in past conflicts into this regression, would your results still hold?
Yeah, so you can definitely throw in last year's conflict or any number of years, and the results are going to be very similar. Yeah. And so I don't think it's so much that the weather is serially correlated, or I'm sure that's true to some extent.
Even, yeah,
conflict is serially, yeah, exactly. So that's why weather 2 periods ago is going to matter today mostly, is because it caused conflict that period and then that persists. Yeah, and you do see that in the data, but even still, you see this contemporaneous effect. And then that's a good.
That makes it even more interesting, right? Because people don't learn, because they're repeatedly engaging in conflicts.
Yeah, that's right. And then it's an interesting thing, because we talked a little bit about this, but like, let's say you're a pastoral group or pastoral family, you have 50 goats, let's say, and you have land where you have this traditional cycle, and then you're hit with a negative rainfall shock. The question is, what can you do to help? Basically, what can you do? You could not move, allow your goats to die. That's not a great outcome. You could move and try to control them and not have them trample any crops. And you try to do that, but that's not always successful. And then that leads to conflict. And then when there's a few years of repeated shocks, you try to do that. Some years you're successful. Sometimes there's conflicts, there's others. Then what do you do? And then we talked about some of the issues. Well, you could become sedentary, you could sell your herds, you could move to the city, you could, but it's a big change, yeah. And so this might all be transition, kind of, transition pains, or and in the long run, we'll get to a different equilibrium. Yeah.
Fair point. Right. I don't know whether you would cover this in your robustness checks or not, but might be interesting to then interact this with indexes or indicators of economic development, and see if this is actually driven by groups that are not that economically developed, and hence they don't have options to make these transitions, in comparison to groups that can actually make this transition very easily.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. And so, and we actually have a follow-up paper where we're looking at foreign aid. So what happens when the government comes in and then tries to implement programs? We see that often they backfire. So when they bring in a program which supports agriculture to pastoralists, then they fight back, actually. And again, this could be short run, but it's just kind of an interesting thing here. Yeah, kind of interesting dynamics. Yeah. Okay, so there's a bunch of robustness. I'm not going to take you through that. The one thing, I call it a robustness, but I think we need to change it. It's actually a test of mechanisms, or a test of the specific story. So if you remember, what's important here is that there's a rainfall shock in my neighbor's territory. The neighbors move, but they move with their animals, and then the animals trample the crops, right? So what's really important is that the group is transhumant pastoral. If they're mobile, they're just transhumant, but they don't have animals, the story doesn't hold. If they're pastoral but they don't move, the story doesn't hold. So one way to think of this is this interaction, which we saw before, is really a triple interaction because it was rainfall times transhumant times pastoral. And then if that's the case, let's control for the double interactions, right? But this, and so that's two different ways of thinking about it. And if we do that, what you find is pastoralism doesn't matter, right? In terms of nearest neighbor rainfall shock causing conflict. Transhumance doesn't matter. It's really only the combination of the two that we see this exact effect, right? And so I think this is a nice prediction of the story, and also is a way to test that specific channel, right? And so it's not that pastoral groups, maybe they're on marginal land, which is very susceptible to adverse rainfall shocks, and pastoral groups have this culture of honor, culture of violence, and therefore a shock in a pastoral territory causes spillover conflict. You don't see that. That's actually here. They have to be transhumant and pastoral, right? So
there's a question in the chat. Let me just bring it up.
Sure.
Are there any examples of sedentary pastoral groups being forced to migrate due to rainfall shocks? And would these be classified as transhumant?
Not well. Traditionally sedentary. I think it would be unlikely that they would migrate then. In that case, I can't think of any examples of really large-scale migrations, which are purely because of weather shocks, and then
Yes.
but that, yeah, I have to go back and look. I think that's I think what's more common is they're traditionally transhuman pastoral groups, but they no longer migrate, right? They've abandoned that tradition. I think that's going to be the more common scenario. Okay, any other questions, comments?
I have a couple of questions. May I ask?
Sure.
Yeah, so
Sure.
This rainfall shock is also going to cause a reduction in food production in these localities where you said Christians, they are farming communities, right? For example, if there's a huge shock in the rainfall, do they, for example, actually prefer these transhumant pastorals to come to their locality because the pastoral communities are also going to bring with them cattle which would be used as food? So do the conflict vary by the amount of rainfall shock that happens in these localities or these regions?
Right. Yeah. So that's actually what these would be testing, right? So this is rainfall shock in your own cell, right? And you see that it doesn't really kind of increase or decrease conflict in the cell. And then this is rainfall shock in your own cell interacted with, are you transhumant pastoral? So you can imagine if you were a farmer, then maybe, that was kind of your story. And you really don't see much going on here. And so the data seems to indicate that whether there's rainfall shocks in your own cell, that doesn't seem to matter for conflict within your own cell, right? And yeah.
Another quick point. So Sarah Lowe's has also written papers about transhumant pastoralism, and she finds that the trust among transhumant pastorals is the outgroup trust is lower as compared to in-group trust. Do you think that's driving the results in some sense because conflict tends to become more aggressive in proportion because there's lesser outgroup trust between pastoral communities and other communities?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It could be part of it. So in her paper, it's a little unclear. Is it specifically transhumant pastoralists or pastoralists? So if it is pastoralism, which is important, then it's going to be captured here. And there's a literature about pastoral groups having this culture of honor, kind of be more aggressive, more violent, particularly towards outsiders. If what she's finding is specific to transhumant pastoralists, then that could be one thing that's specific about transhumant pastoralists. So that could be part of it, is that transhumant pastoralists, they come, they move, and when they move, they tend to have lower levels of trust of those around them. But the one thing I would say is from the ethnographic atlas, or sorry, from the ethnographic evidence, that the relations traditionally between these pastoral groups and the farmers are pretty cooperative. So they're typically described as symbiotic relationships, win-win. There's certainly some conflicts, but historically they're pretty cooperative and pretty well developed. So, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so there's a few tests of the mechanisms which we go through, and so for this specific story, and yeah, the rainfall should matter more for conflict on agricultural land. So far I've just looked at grid cells. We haven't distinguished between, are these grid cells agricultural or not? So if it's the story, we should see that the conflict is focused on agricultural grid cells. It should be, the rainfall should affect conflict during the wet season, which is kind of, if you step back and just think of it from an atheoretical point of view, you might think that adverse rainfall shocks are going to have their worst effect when water is scarce. In other words, during the dry season, right? So, but this is saying when water is plentiful, that's when adverse rainfall shocks actually cause conflict, right? And so it's a bit counterintuitive, but once you think of the story about the seasonal movement, the reason that is because that's when the farmers are using that land, right? Because that's the growing season. Since rainfall matters because it affects plant growth, if we looked at plant growth instead of rainfall, we should see the same thing. So it's not, you know, that's important because the channel is rainfall, plant growth, and then migration. There's other channels like rainfall affects the ability to move troops because of the quality of the roads, and that affects conflict. So Torsten Rogal, for example, is, so this just helps us be sure that that's what's going on. And then if we looked at other things like temperature, we shouldn't see the same thing, right? So we'll go through this pretty quickly. This is the first estimates. If we just divide the sample into grid cells that are agricultural and grid cells that are non-agricultural, you see that the vast majority of this is coming from agricultural grid cells. That's columns 1 to 4. Non-agricultural cells, you do see something, but it's a lot weaker, right? And even the wrong sign in these cases, right? So it's really about agricultural grid cells, and that's kind of like the magnet that's drawing these pastoral groups. If we estimate it by season, so just divide it up by the seasons, what you find is you find estimates or estimated relationship during the wet season, but not the dry season. Okay, if we do it by agricultural grid cells and not, it's wet season and also agricultural grid cells. Okay, so that lines up. If we use phytomass instead of rainfall, so the exact same thing, the phytomass in my nearest neighboring ethnic group, you find the exact same relationship. Okay, so a negative relationship. If you look at the magnitudes, right, because the units are different in terms of the phytomass measure, the magnitudes, these standardized estimates, are very similar to what we saw before. And then phytomass by season, you see the same thing. Okay. And if we look at temperature rather than rainfall, you don't see an effect, right? Which is important because we know that temperature doesn't really affect plant growth. Okay, so any questions about that? We have about 20 minutes, I think, to for the next issues. Yeah. Okay, so then the next thing we can do is think about, okay, there seems to be evidence for the story. Those newspaper articles that we see that say, oh, climate change is causing conflict between farmers and herders because of scarcity, that seems to have some validity. Now can we leverage our estimates to try and understand what can be done to help fix the situation? Okay, and that's this point here. And then the other thing, just on the way, we're going to do is how much of the increase in religious violence or jihadi violence that we've seen on the continent, I'll show you a graph, it's been increasing, is due to climate change and then farmer-herder conflicts. So for the first thing, what we're going to do is just very coarsely try and identify which conflicts are what the newspaper would call jihadi conflicts, or what we would commonly call jihadi conflicts. And so we identify these as if the word jihad is in the participant's name, or it's in the title of the source article, or Islam is present in the title, and then the conflict involves one group, at least one group, that's explicitly jihadist, has jihadi motives. Okay, and so when we do that, we can then divide all conflicts into jihadists and non-jihadists, and this is the average fraction of cells in the sample, right? Those grid cells that have a conflict, that have a jihadi conflict, and that have a non-jihadi conflict. Okay, and this is just for each year. And so you can see that the prevalence of these jihadist conflicts has been increasing over time and catching up to the non-jihadist conflicts, which have been pretty stable. Okay, so just a very simple thing to do, the natural thing to do is, well, let's run the regression, but the Y variable is jihadist conflicts, and then the Y variable is non-jihadist conflicts. Okay, so if rainfall in the territory of transhuman pastoral groups is unrelated to jihadi conflicts, we should see no effect. But we see a coefficient here actually, right? Negative and significant, and roughly similar in magnitude to the non-jihadist conflicts. Okay, and we can also control for actually religion explicitly. Rainfall in my nearest neighbor interacted with whether they're Muslim, or the extent to which they're Muslim, whether they're Christian, and then this effect remains robust, right? And so really some evidence that this really does seem to be about farmer and herders, and also climate change as well. Okay. And if you look at the magnitudes, there's this kind of ironic thing. The estimated coefficients are the same, but these are the marginal effects, right? And we know that here we're starting at a lower level. So if you just calculate the effects relative to the mean, how much is this causing an increase, it's much, much more important for the jihadist conflicts than the non-jihadist conflicts. Okay, so that's interesting. We won't dwell on this too much, but just kind of points out that, okay, this rise in religious violence on the continent, it might have some roots in climate change, and then these conflicts which are emerging between farmers and herders, right? And there's a lot of narrative about, well, how is it that these jihadi groups get support? And it's because these pastoral groups are feeling like they're wronged by the government, because there are these conflicts and the government tends to take the side of the farmers, right? And so we'll see a bit more of that in some results in a few slides.
But it could also be that it's not a support issue, but jihadist groups find it optimal to appropriate issues which they can see is happening, and it kind of makes it seem more contemporary and so on and so forth, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be based out of support. It just has to be based out of the topic being of interest and therefore subject to appropriation by different groups.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so they're kind of getting involved, there's this spark, and then there's this grievance, and then they get involved. Exactly. Yeah. And then it gets coded as a jihadi conflict. Yeah, exactly. And so they see an opportunity, exactly as you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay, this part I think is actually quite interesting. I'm glad I have a bit of time. So once you hear about climate change, there are things immediately that come to mind. Okay, let's combat climate change. Let's have irrigation, drip irrigation, for example. Let's build wells. Let's have water resource projects. Let's create conservation lands, right? Let's put money into forestry to preserve trees. Let's try and improve the land. These are all things which are done to fight combat climate change. Question is, which is a narrower question, is, well, do any of these things help combat or reduce the conflict that we've identified in the first part of the presentation? Okay, and so how we're going to do this is we're going to get data from aid data on all foreign funded development projects, which are essentially all projects, all government projects within the continent, from 47 to 2013. We're going to create a measure. This is all just very crude, but create a measure of the cumulative number of projects, project locations in a country and year since 1947, and just normalized by country size. So we basically say what grid cells have had a project, and then just aggregate those up. Okay. And then what we're going to do is just allow our coefficients to differ. So remember, it was rainfall interact with transhumant pastoral, and just say, is that coefficient different in countries and time periods with a 1-year lag that have had a lot of foreign aid? Okay, we can look at different types of aid, we'll break it down, but that's kind of the idea. So it's not causal, but it's more descriptive in just saying in which countries and years are the estimated coefficients closer towards 0, and does that have anything to do, is it correlated with how much foreign aid they've received?
Sorry.
Okay,
is
so
this
this
foreign aid cumulative or just last year?
no, it's cumulative. Yeah. So we could do different things, but it's cumulative up until last year, just because, you know, if you build a dam or build a well or introduce a certain technology, the kind of the thought here is, okay, that's a stock. Yeah, which helps you. Yeah.
Given that sometimes these cells would go over the national boundaries, would you include foreign aid given to neighboring countries or just the country where the conflict is actually?
No. Yeah, so each cell we look at the centroid of the cell, and then what country does that centroid fall within, and then that's the country that we assign that cell to. And so that's how we do it. Yeah. So we haven't looked at spillovers either mechanically, or cells that might be split between countries. We haven't looked at that. Okay, so what do we see here? This is rainfall interacted with transhumant pastoralism. And then if these things are having benefits, we should see positive and significant coefficients. Okay, and we don't see that for agricultural aid. If anything, that tends to be negative. And for non-agricultural aid, it's positive, but small, very small. Okay, so there's not glaring evidence that this fixes the problem. But then you might think, oh, well, but you haven't looked at the right type of aid. And so here we divide things into irrigation, forestry, conservation, land. And again, no evidence that these are in general positive and significant. The most robust finding here is that other agricultural aid makes things worse. It's actually negative and significant here. Okay, but yeah, so definitely doesn't help. This could be, you know, you might think that this makes things worse, but also it's pretty marginal. The other thing we're going to look at is actually conservation land. And so this is a lot of land has been set aside for conservation. And so these are protected areas here. This is kind of shown in this figure here. And one thing you can see is it actually causes a lot of problems for herders. So this was a traditional route. And now if they've created a conservation area like here, typically what happens with these conservation areas is herders are not allowed in the conservation area, or if they are, often they're charged fees, and there's a lot of corruption, bribery, which occurs, and then conflict. And so this could disrupt the routes. They might have to choose alternative routes, which could cause problems, or there might be fighting between the park rangers and then the pastoral groups. Okay, and so there's a lot of reason actually to think, even though conservation might be great for combating climate change, it's not going to help fix this problem. Okay. And what you see in the data is actually pretty consistent with that. So this, if it was helping, it would be positive and significant, right? And so we just measure, again, the amount of conservation land in a country in a year. But if anything, it's negative and significant. Okay. And then this just gives you a sense of the magnitude. For the 10th percentile, the effect we find, and that's rainfall interact with transhumant pastoralism, is minus 11.9. That's percent relative to the mean. And the 90th percentile is 54%. Okay, so neither of those things help, or kind of the development projects or conservation. And then the other thing I guess I should say about the development projects, if you think of it, what they tend to do is make agricultural land even more productive. And the problem is that the agricultural land is more productive than the pastoral land. So you're just making it more attractive for the herders to come to. So it's actually not a logical reason why it would help once you start to sit down and think about it, actually. Okay, and then the other thing you hear in the literature is about political representation. And the story is, I've alluded to this, is pastoral groups tend to lack political power, right? It's because they live in the rural, less densely populated parts of the country. They're far from the capital city. During the colonial period, the colonial government kind of ignored them. They tried to settle them, but in general, they weren't successful in the area. And so pastoral groups, tend not to have a lot of voice in national politics. And so some have suggested that this, just feeds into the problem, right? That when there's conflict, the resolution is very one-sided, and then that might lead to more conflict. And in Nigeria, a great example of this is actually grazing bans, where they've outlawed the movement of animals except in motorized vehicles, right? So you can have animals, you can move them to slaughter, for example, but only in motorized vehicles. So they've essentially outlawed this way of life. And so that's kind of an unbalanced way to try and solve the issue. Okay. And so one question is, well, if we increase the political representation of pastoral groups, does this help alleviate or reduce the effects of climate change? And so we collect information, or we have information from the ethnic power relations database, which for each ethnic group in each country, it indicates how much power they have. Okay, these are the different categories. We assign a numeric value to each category, and you can actually add up the values because it is zero sum, right? Only one group can have monopoly power, and only a few groups can be junior partners, for example. So you can kind of add up the total amount of power and then calculate how much power is held by transhumant pastoral groups. Okay, and this is, again, at a country and year level. So we do the exact same thing that we did before, where we look for heterogeneity across countries and years. This is only countries with pastoral populations, and this is just the distribution of the share of power held by transhumant pastoral groups. You can see it's typically less than 0.5. Okay, so we're going to look at the interaction of this measure with rainfall interacted with transhumant pastoralism. Okay, so that's there. And what we find here, so this is in contrast to development projects, to the conservation land. Here you find a positive and significant coefficient. So it's actually helping, right? So if you increase the share of power that transhumant pastoral groups have, then the effect of rainfall on conflict is weaker. And these are the calculations, the same as before: 10th percentile, 90th percentile. At the 10th percentile, so low transhumant pastoralism, it's like one standard deviation leads to 60% relative to the mean, but then it's very close to zero for the countries and years that have the 90th percentile transhumant pastoralism power share. Okay, so this is kind of consistent with a lot of NGOs which are attuned to the issues of pastoral groups, which tend to be ignored in development. This is kind of one thing that they really highlight as being important, which is kind of why we looked at it. And the data are consistent with that. Okay.
So is it, Nathan, because it's an appeasement of a particular community, or is it the fact that once you have for example, if you allow a particular legislative position to be fought between different people from, let's say the same pastoral group, they will require support from not only the pastoral groups but also from the sedentary farmers, and so it's not clear then that the appeasement is only for the pastoral group, but because they need support from the farming group too, that you would see a more a resolution of these kind of conflicts.
Yeah, I think that's right. This would be consistent with, well, if you have a resolution that's balanced, that you need to give, not just fight against one side and then that'll cause the conflict to die down more quickly. I don't know that we have evidence of that, but that would be consistent with that. And I think the grazing bans are a great example. Like, if you're not responsive to pastoral groups, you'd implement something like a grazing ban, but there's no way that they can really adhere to the grazing ban, and so there's people breaking the law all over the place. And then of course that leads the police or the military to engage in corrupt acts and be able to hold up or give someone a hard time whenever they want, and then that'll be seen as unjust, and it's not gonna resolve things. So
the question is, how big are they pivotal in elections, right? The pastoral group as a group, because if they were pivotal in elections, you would expect, irrespective of who gets elected, for there to be a resolution of these problems, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly the issue, is they're not pivotal. And so if you think about what's the primary determinant of this, like this is the share that transhumant pastoral groups have. It's because they typically tend to be small, and so just their share in the population explains this quite a lot, right? And so exactly, if they were pivotal, or if they were a larger proportion, closer to the median voter, then then issues would be resolved in a more balanced way. So I guess the good news is, well, in these countries where the share is so small, those are countries where the issues should be kind of small, because it's not a lot of transhumant pastoral groups. But yeah. Okay, any other questions, comments? Okay, great. So I'll just conclude. I think everyone, has a good sense of what we did here. I think the one thing I'll say is, we started interested in conflict and then climate change, and then we're also interested in pastoralism. I think this has really opened our eyes to the importance of pastoralism for development. So when you think of development, I know, I have in the past, and just thought about, okay, it's the transition from agriculture to manufacturing. And you think, okay, agriculture basically is developing countries. But then once you look at the data, there's a huge swath of groups that are transhumant pastoral, the Middle East, Central Asia, and then in Africa as well. And it's 22, almost 25%, almost a quarter of the world's population. And this, I think, shows that there are special issues related to pastoral groups. And so that's something we're continuing to look at and think about these issues in relation to development and things like foreign aid. And so, I think there will be a follow-up paper that looks at that. But anyways, happy to answer any other questions.
Okay, so if there are questions, you can ask me. We had quite a few, so let me just take this time to thank our speaker and all the people who have come with their questions. So if there aren't anything, we can just formally end the seminar right now. And let me just stop the recording.